Wescom Credit Union. Mark is the Vice President of Information Security and Chief Information Security Officer at Wescom Credit Union, a leading credit union headquartered in Southern California. He's responsible for leading and maturing Wescom's information security program. He received his MBA from Cal State Fullerton and a Bachelor of Science at Atino di Manlala University. He has worked in the information security field for over 20 years across various verticals, including financial, healthcare, government, manufacturing, consulting, and software. He currently holds the following industry certificates. He's a CISSP, he's a CISM, a ENCE, as well as certifications from the SANS Institute. Today, he's going to be speaking on lessons from the trenches, effectively communicating cyber risks to the board. So everyone, let's welcome Mark to the stage.
Hello. All right, so quick question. How did the hacker get away from the policeman? Great. So we got a great audience. He ran somewhere, for those of you who didn't hear it. So I just did that just to get a gauge for our audience. Sounds like we got a really smart and intelligent audience here. So thank you all for quickly introduce myself here. So my name is Mark Dy-Ragos, as Kim had mentioned. And I work as the CISO for Wescom Credit Union. So we're a credit union serving Southern and Central California, and our goal is to build better lives for Californians. I've been there about almost 9 years. It's a fantastic organization to work for. I probably will end my career here if they will have me. And a quick shameless plug, we are hiring for an identity and access management engineer, in case any of you are looking in that area. So in terms of career, right? So one of the questions that I get asked most often is, how did I get to where I am, right? And so when it comes to answering that, there's obviously a lot of factors, right? It's being in the right place at the right time, having a supportive manager, a supportive environment, and finding an organization where your culture jives with your values. But the one area that I did have, I guess, a little bit more impact and influence over was being able to present technical concepts to leadership, right? And so that was, in my opinion, that's the one area that really helped me. It helped me get visibility. It helped me build trust. And that's really what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about some tips, some lessons I've learned throughout my career, and how I honed this and how I started presenting to leadership. So to kind of start you off on this journey, right, I want to present to you, I got invited to a committee level meeting. And I was an attendee at that time, but it was a high-level security committee level meeting, and there were senior leaders all around, right? So this was a meeting that was comprised of some IT folks, but then there were some leaders in the meeting. And then when I looked at the deck, I saw this slide, right? This is where I kind of started. I was looking at the deck, and I was like, okay, this is a very technical-looking slide. So we must have some very technical senior leaders here. If they can tell me what a DNS reputation attack is, right? Or if they can tell me what a SIP brute force attack is. I mean, obviously, they would need to know this if we're going to present it. So, well, it turns out that, no, they didn't know what this stuff was. But we were putting it in there anyway, right? And so there was probably a reason, right? I'm not trying to knock anyone who was building these decks before, but maybe at some point there was a reason where, hey, we thought it might be a good idea. Let's tell our senior leadership about our top attacks. And if you don't recognize this, this is from an IPS, right? It came from about 10 years ago. Nothing wrong with this report, by the way. It's just that there's probably a good place and a time and the right audience for this type of data. So I looked at it and I said, well, if no one's using it, then maybe we need to cut this out, right? Maybe we should look at something else. So eventually I got put in charge of chairing this committee. and I had to build the slide deck for it. So now it was like, okay, I'm such a big critic about what's going in here. What would I put in, right? And so, everyone, some of you probably have been to a lot of these conferences. You hear it all the time, right? Oh, risk is the language of business, right? You have to speak their language. Don't bring to them, pen test findings and technical jargon. So I didn't have a whole lot of time, but I had to put together a deck. And so I thought, well, what can I show them that I think would be great, right? So I thought to myself, vulnerability management, right? Vulnerability management is something everybody has to do. We have to do it. Maybe I can take a slide. So I went into our VM tool, and I picked out a slide. I was like, great. This slide is going to show them risk. Oh, I was so proud of myself, right? I was like, oh, this is a great slide. I can show them that we have a lot of vulnerabilities, we have risk, and here's what it looks like. And so they looked at me and said, okay, this slide, and this is a sample data, obviously, but it was something very similar to this. And so they came to me and they said, oh, so we have a risk score of 7 million. I said, yeah. What does that mean? It just means it's high, right? Well, okay. Well, how high is it? I don't know. It's just high, right? I didn't have a great answer for them. And then they said, okay, well, that's fine. You know it's high. Well, what should we be at? And I said, well, we should be lower, right? Well, how much lower? And so I said, well, 0? So again, I didn't have a great answer, but they were really good questions, right? When I came in with this slide, right, I thought to myself, well, I'm just here to tell them things are bad, right? And this was the whole, fear, uncertainty, and doubt approach, right? Doom and gloom, right? You got to give me money, things are bad. But they came back and they challenged me, and they said, but if anything that I gained from this is I got a reaction. Right? If you think about the IPS slide I previously showed, that just kind of went, whoop, nobody looked at it, right? This one, at least, they asked me questions. They challenged me. So I was on the right path. So I went back and I said, okay, there's a few things I learned from this, right? Is one, I have to put myself in their shoes, right? These are not people who do cyber on a day-to-day basis. They're responsible for managing the business. So I took some of the key points, though, right? If you heard it, they said, okay, well, what should we be, right? That's one thing. And what's a good number to be at? So I went back, and it took me a while, right? It took almost maybe a year or more. We worked out some different strategies. We tried a few things. We took a patching report, and we threw it at them and said, hey, what do you think about this, right? And the patching report was a step forward because it told you, hey, this is kind of, your patches that are within time frame. These are the ones that that are probably over 90 days, right? And so patching, though, is not the complete picture, right? Patching, in my opinion, it's more of a KPI where you're measuring the operational efficiency of your patching team. So I went back and I said, okay, what can I do with vulnerability metrics? So I had this design. I figured out what I wanted to do. I mocked it up in Excel, and then I went to my architect sitting over here, Daniel. I said, Daniel, help me make this into an image that I can present. And so he busted out his advanced Power Query knowledge, and he helped me build this, right? So this is where I ended up at the next step, right? So I went to them, and I said, okay, this is what I'd like to present to you. Right? So these were the vulnerability metrics that I brought at the next phase, right? And so let me just kind of break it down just a little bit for how it works, right? So the first thing is we set targets. We set zones first. We created risk zones. So we said not every asset in the organization needs to be treated the same, right? You may have assets that are more important than others. And so probably if you have a vulnerability that's publicly exposed on your DMZ, you probably want to address that first before something that's sitting way deep into your network that maybe you could only physically access, right? Those are just kind of the ends of the extreme here. But that's how we did it. We created zones. And again, conceptually, this looks, it looks very simple and easy, right? But again, underneath the hood, there's so much running to get here. You have to tag all your assets. You have to figure out these assets are public, these assets are internal, these assets are on the DMZ, these are servers, workstations, printers. And so I make it sound simple. It's not simple. Vulnerability management is an endless thankless, tireless job, right? You got to constantly be updating your metrics and your assets. So a few things that this accomplished. One is we set a target, right? We set a target for, let's say, 2 days for the highest risk items. 2 days, then we had 7 days for the next high risk items, then we went on 30 days, and then we went to 60 and 180 days based on location and priority. So now we answered a lot of those concerns, right? What do we need to be at? We need to have items patched within that SLA. What else did we do? We set that target, and we set our performance against that target. Now we can say, hey, we were doing great on the external side, right? That's one thing that we were doing great. But it also highlighted where we had deficiencies, right? We weren't meeting targets on, for example, in this graph, you'd say internal servers that are high, right? That's a problem. That's still a problem. And that was part of what I went out to accomplish. I wanted to tell them we have issues. The issue isn't just it's bad. This isn't saying it's bad, right? What this says is that we are only able to focus on certain areas of the environment. And then we have deficiencies in other ways. And so what did this accomplish, right? So, and a few things, by the way, is, so the icons there will tell you, obviously, we make it easy, right? Make it easy for your reader to know, right? So obviously, when you look at this, you know that that 17% or the 2.51% are really bad, right? And so as a reader, I didn't leave it up to interpretation. I told them, hey, these are the areas where I think we need to make adjustments. So with that in mind, right now we had discussions. And so I brought this to our board and audit committee, and I showed it to them, right? I said, this is what we have, and this is what this is the current state of the environment. And there was a very uncomfortable conversation that ensued after that. They said, well, why? How did you get to this point? And, you know, obviously it was very uncomfortable, but it was necessary. The people in that room needed to hear those comments because now, you know, our senior leadership was there, our CEO was in the room, and other senior VPs were in the room, and now they realized, hey, there is some work we need to be done. And so that created this change wherein now we had everyone's eyes and ears. Hey, we're going to fix vulnerability management, right? This is a stark contrast from me telling them we have a risk score of 7.5 million. Now we're telling them, hey, we have deficient areas in our environment. And this wasn't only a one-way thing where I'm just telling the board. I took this to the operations team. And when you take something like this to the operations team, it gives them something to like sink their teeth into, right? When I tell them our risk score is 7.5 million, they go out, they patch maybe 50, 100 systems, painstakingly patching them. And then our risk score goes down to 7 million. It's like, great. It's still bad, right? So you need to give your operations team also, you need to give them something to keep them motivated. And this chart effectively did that for us, right? And so, for example, if they patched all the systems in the DMZ, that 2% would probably shoot up to 60%. And as an engineer, sometimes you probably want to see that. You want to see that you're making a difference. So those are all the things that came about from this chart. I wanted to show it to you as an example. And really, we eventually were able to load this into Power BI. Again, Daniel went on a learning spree and said, hey, this is probably better to automate. In Power BI, we were able to do data extracts from our VM tool, and then we were able to automate this, and now we have this full-blown dashboard that automatically gets updated. I did want to revisit, though, a slide very similar what I showed to our team later, right? It's very similar to the VM export I showed you earlier, but this is a different perspective now. So now I wasn't bringing this in to show them, hey, we have all these vulnerabilities that are unpatched. What I was here to tell them was, hey, this is how much the team has done. Look at where we were a year ago. We had all these vulnerabilities, and look at us now, right? The team focused their efforts, and we've made progress. And that's what they want to see, right? You see a couple things here. You see trends. You see, you don't really see targets. So this isn't something I necessarily show them on a day-to-day like risk type. I still revert to the other slide, but this is really to show them, hey, this is where we're at. This is the progress we've made. So a couple lessons, right? Just wanted to recap. What did I learn from this? First, you need to frame your metrics, right? You need to set that target. put yourselves in the eyes of the ones who are viewing this, right? So frame your metrics, set a target. Some common things you'll see is, all right, what's standard in the industry for this? That's why we set those vulnerability remediation targets. We looked out there, okay, what's the standard on getting a high-risk vulnerability remediated? And then you look at peer comparisons. So not every industry will do this. In our industry, it's fairly common. What are our peers doing in this aspect? Help me understand this. And if you think about it, right, your board members, you are one slice of what they're looking at, right? To you, it's the whole world, right? This is our world. Cyber is our world. To them, this is just one small thing, right? So imagine you're a homeowner. A lot of you live in a home or have some sort of home responsibilities, right? If somebody comes to you and says, "Hey, I'll bring you a quote to fix your roof. It's $100,000." The first thing you're going to do is like, well, is that high or is that low, right? So it's the same concept, right? Maybe you don't fix roofs on a day-to-day basis, but what you're going to want to ask is this high? Is this low, right? Or what's standard in the industry? So try to keep that in mind when you're bringing these metrics to your board, right? And the second one, I know this sounds, when I was rereading this, I was like, man, this sounds so obvious, but know your objectives, right? And so the thing is that sometimes when you're given a task, you may forget to circle it back to your objectives, right? A lot of us here are engineers. You tell me to generate a report on risk status, and you'll build it, but you may not remember what your objective is in presenting that. And so it sounds so simple in concept, but you need to make sure, are your metrics supporting that? Are they telling the story that you're trying to accomplish, right? And in my case, I wanted to highlight, with the vulnerability example, I did want to bring to them concepts, right? This is the state, and this is where we need to be moving, right? We may need to bring more resources that are focused on addressing these vulnerabilities. So that was my objective, right? It's just something to keep in mind whenever you're building these scores, right? As you get into your data manipulation platforms, your Power BI, your Tableau or Excel, whatever it is you're using, try to just fact check yourself when you're done. Are these objectives supporting the story? And maybe if it's your story, maybe you're not the one presenting, maybe it's going to your leadership, ask them, what is the story you want to tell? This is what I think, right? So, and obviously you're going to be using visuals to tell that story. I'm going to take a quick drink here. Okay, so then the next story I'd like to share with you was, again, how did I present my risk assessment to leadership, right? So again, risk assessments, right? You hear it everywhere. Oh, it's risk assessment. And so, again, I was given this task working in a financial institution, right? This is a requirement, right? For GLBA, you're required to do a risk assessment of threats to your member information. So, again, I was coming from a network security background, so I was like, well, this isn't really something I'd done to that extent. But I was going to figure it out, and I'm going to take you along with me on my journey here, in case some of you are ever able to do this, right? So, risk assessment. The reason why I chose this image was, again, we had the requirement, right? We needed to deliver some sort of risk assessment to our board, and so what I did is I went out and I found some software. Software had a questionnaire, and just said, "Oh, just answer all these questions," and it built this risk assessment for me. 150 pages of wonderful reading, right? I don't even know if I read the whole thing cover to cover, right? I mean, it was so long. It was so much in it. But what I did was, I made the mistake. I took it and I submitted it. I say, here, board, take a look at this, right? So they probably, again, it probably just went. They said, okay, we have to review this. They reviewed it, and then it went through, right? So, and then obviously, when we scrutinized this, we were like, okay, this needs to have a little bit of work. You can't just submit something. It met the requirements, but you need to do a little more. So what I did was I went out and I worked with a consulting firm, and we built this very, very detailed risk assessment. It was in the Excel sheet. There were over 15,000 lines, I guess, creating a permutation between threats, assets, and the different controls we had. And our threat library was massive. We looked at the high-trust threat catalog. We expanded every single threat, and we mapped it against every asset. And if you think about the permutations there, it was massive. I couldn't report on this in its current state. I had to feed this data into Power BI. And that's what you kind of see here. And it created these risk scores. And then all I could say was, hey, here's how our different risks plot out on a heat map, right? And hopefully y'all can see that. But the point is that it was fancy. But in many cases, as I mentioned here, we overthought it, over-engineered it, right? We put too many people who are excited about getting all the taxonomy of threat, risk, assets, getting all that right and getting it all together. And this is what came out, right? It technically made sense. It checked all the requirements, but it didn't mean anything. It was hard to understand, right? And if you look at it, our top threat is spear phishing. What does that mean, right? It just means our top threat is spear phishing. So it didn't drive kind of the action that we were looking for. So I actually scaled back. And I went back to our requirements, and I ended up with something very simple, right? So this is what I'm still presenting, what I ended up presenting. It's not, there's a few more lines to this. I just took an excerpt, though, right? So we built something in Excel that just says, hey, these are our risks. These are the top risks to the organization. There's probably, I think we identified 9 risk categories where you can summarize all the different risks, right? Like, phishing is a form of social engineering. Vishing, quishing, all the new stuff, right? That's really rolling up into social engineering. But underneath this dashboard, there's all these different risks and controls. Underneath it is where we talk about, hey, we have all these, the social engineering awareness platform, you have the anti-phishing, you have all those, and then you note the control, you map it against your risk, and then you note any exceptions, right? So those are all supportive of this final document. But you don't want to show that whole risk control matrix to your board because one, if it's too long, they're not going to read it. Unless you have an auditor on your board or anything like that. And I did. That's why I share that. And he did meticulously go through everything. But for the most part, you want to share with them what you think needs to be shared. And so this is an example, right, if we say we have systems that are missing MFA, this is how you start the conversation, right? This is how we take all the different risk activities that you're seeing, right? Sometimes you may know that there's something bad in your environment, but you may not know how to capture it, right? And that's really what the heart of these risk assessments is. Is that risk, where does it bubble up, right? Let's say, you have an external FTP system that's not locked down and it's housing sensitive data on it, right? Well, that should raise the residual risk of our loss or theft of confidential data to probably high, right? Because you know that could get compromised without much effort. So that's kind of where we ended up. I'm probably not going to stop here in terms of our journey. I do want to mature it a little bit. This is kind of a preview of what my future state is for how I handle risk assessments. Wanted to use a little bit more quantifiable metrics. What you see here is called a loss exceedance curve. If you look at, one of the methods, there's a lot of risk assessment methods out there. There's COSO, there's a COBIT, Octave. This one is from FAIR, and they use what they call a quantitative risk analysis. And so what you see here, and again, this is more just for sharing, is the organization will set their risk tolerance, right? That's what that green line represents. This is the amount of risk. So they're willing to accept, on the left side, it's high, right? They're willing to accept a high amount of risk if the dollar amount is like less than $10, right? So, and that's natural to business, right? You have some exposure to loss. But once that curve starts to move to the right and get into the $1 million mark, then your tolerance becomes much lower. And any time that your residual risk exceeds that tolerance, then you have a problem, right? This makes your discussions very easy. It's not subjective. It's quantitative, where you just go and you say, hey, you told me this was your risk tolerance, and I think we've exceeded it here. What should we do, right? And then you tell them, this is what I think we need to do. Here's how we remediate it. I need $50,000 to implement this new control to reduce the risk in this area. So, lessons learned, right? You have to think to yourself, first of all, why am I providing them this information? So going back to the example I mentioned earlier, right? When I took that my first step into providing them the risk assessment. I did it, and I threw it at them just to get it done, right? And so you might have heard this term before. Compliance is not security, right? Compliance is not security. And that's what happened there, right? We had a compliance requirement. We did what it took to get it done, and we just did it, but we didn't really equate it to security. But again, I'm not saying it's a bad thing, right? It's a part of your journey. If that's where you're at, that's where you're at. You have to take some steps, right? And if that's where the first step is, but then you just need to realize, okay, if you're going to be going through all the trouble of doing something like this, let's make it worthwhile. Let's make it meaningful, right? And at least you've now had that compliance objective met. And so that's why you need to think to yourself, why am I providing this information? And so, again, going back to some of these concepts we've been talking about, risk is your weapon, right? Being able to communicate risk. It's not, well, maybe I shouldn't say it's your weapon, but it's what you communicate to them with. If you say you need a new headcount on your team, probably one of the hardest things to ask for, right? But if you can provide them risk metrics that tell them this is the risk, and this is what happens when we don't add new headcount, our ability to, for example, respond or detect risks or threats in our environment goes down. And I think you heard it earlier from David at TPX, right? The dwell time has gone down, right? You don't have 2 months to find threats in your environment anymore. You may have minutes, days, seconds. So sometimes you may need to quantify that into your risk assessments to help you formulate those arguments. A few other things, right? Will the information be understood? Make sure that you bounce some of the concepts you're presenting. Bounce it off your peers. Bounce it off your family and friends even, right? Because try to get someone outside your industry. Tell them, hey, does this make sense to you? What do you think this metric is saying, right? Because probably the people you're presenting this to will have around the same amount of knowledge as some of your peers who are not in the industry. They may know the business really well, but they may not know what the cyber threats and risk metrics that you're presenting to them are about. The next thing is, will this information drive action or encourage discussions? I think I talked about that a little earlier. That's a further maturity step, right? If you can get them to be engaged, then they can help be your proponents of change as well. And then lastly, right, I thought I'd throw this in there. When we overbuilt that risk assessment product, is make sure you have the ability to support it. The spreadsheet I ended up with at that time was, it had so many queries running. It took a few minutes to open, right? And so anytime I made an adjustment, it had to recalculate, and it made me nervous. It made me nervous making updates to that risk assessment model because it impacted all those 15,000 lines every time I made a change. And so if I made a mistake, I could be creating a report that either was inaccurate or I couldn't defend. So that's why sometimes make sure if you do have something that's very complex, that you have a team that can support it. Well, obviously, simple is better than complex. So if you can get to the point where you simplify it, you'll probably be in a much better place. A few more things I learned along the way here is, we are in the business, right, of reporting risk. We're reporting current state. We're almost in a way, we're telling others, hey, this is where some of our deficiencies are. But what it shouldn't be is, it shouldn't be you saying, hey, this guy's not doing his job, right? That can happen. That can easily happen. And that's why sometimes there is that relationship that gets contentious between security and other parts of the business, right? And so try to do your best to avoid that, right? Pull them aside. Pull over your VP of IT or pull over your IT counterparts if you're in separate divisions. Talk to them and say, hey, I'm going to report this to the board, right? And this is the state. I have to present it like this. And you can make a positive out of it, right? You're saying, my goal is not to embarrass you or your team, but maybe we use this as an opportunity to get you more resources, get you that product you wanted. And so try to take that approach because you're going to be working with these people in the long term, and nobody really wants somebody security already, right? Sometimes we get this bad rap that we're know-it-alls and we try to do too much, right? So extend the olive branch, build those bridges, right? Because that's how you get the organization to the state that you both want to be at. And I've talked about this a little bit though, studying your audience. Right? You have to study who you're going to be presenting to, right? Try to use analogies that may resonate with them, that may help your conversation. Just because, depending on what industry you're in, they may, or if you can even do research, right? If you can look them up on LinkedIn, read their bios, you may be able to establish connections with 1 or 2 people in your audience, and that will really go a long way at communicating your risk and your metrics to them. And lastly, I probably mentioned this, but try to keep your message simple. Resist the urge to tell them everything, right? You can't tell them everything. You only have 5 minutes. They can't absorb everything. Right? So you have to simmer down your points and figure out what it is you want them to take away. So let's put this all together, right? So let me just kind of recap what I've talked about today. First, the what. What do we present? Try to present some sort of KPI. So KPI, again, as I mentioned earlier, key performance indicators. KPIs are there for you to show or gauge the effectiveness of operations. Right? That's really what they mean, right? How well are we doing patching? How well are we doing at it, right? Or how well are we encrypting our resources or deploying controls, right? It's more of an operational metric to gauge performance. And then you have your key risk indicators. This is where you tell them, hey, these items are coming out of risk tolerance, right? In a way, the vulnerability management was kind of a little bit of both. It was a KRI in the sense that it told them we have risks in this area of our environment, of our network. But if you can distill it down further, though, and say, hey, we have risks in, let's say, our cloud environment, just because we don't have visibility. Again, you can say we're increasing our cloud footprint, but we don't have the necessary monitoring tools for them. Then now you can say that this risk is increasing with the increased expansion that your organization may be doing in cloud or SaaS workloads. And the last thing that you can present, right? This is definitely not a definitive list. You can present. There's many things you can present once you start to get into that comfort with them. But then you can, if you want to, right? Going back to the first slide, there's a time and a place to present attack metrics. Probably not that level of detail that the IPS report, but if you can show them, hey, this is the environment that we're operating in. We're getting, let's say, social engineering calls hitting our help desk twice a month, 3 times a week, right? That's an attack metric that describes your environment, and it may support some of the initiatives that you're working at. Again, if it falls back into your story, right? What is the story you want to tell them? And so how do we present this, right? So first, these are just some things that I've learned, right? So first is you need to show trends, right? They want to see trends. If you're going to deliver a report that shows performance, you need to put it into perspective, right? Is our performance now better than before? Are we performing worse? And that will drive your action, right? One of them will say, good job, right? You're doing great. The investments that have been made into this area are working. If the trend shows the wrong way, then it could be an indication that the resources weren't sufficient or something has changed that's making it ineffective. I talked about this earlier, peer and industry comparisons. You may get that a lot, and that's something that you can hone in on. If you don't know what your metrics will tell you, try to go out and find it, right? So how do you get this information? It's probably one of the questions. So let's say you're doing a security assessment from a consultant or a third party. Ask them, hey, how does our maturity level measure against others? You can ask, like, if you're doing a pen test, hey, how does our results measure against other organizations of our size? And I've heard some debate on this. I've heard a few pen testing companies say, hey, you shouldn't be asking that question, right? It's meaningless. Focus on the data I'm giving you, right? And so that's an example, right? They may have a valid point, but that's also an example of, hey, you're not knowing your audience here. If the audience is a bunch of pen testers, great. You can take to them these critical and high pen testing results, and they'll get it. They know, hey, this is bad. I need to do something. But if you take that to, again, your leadership, your business leaders, they may not know. They may need help. They may need to see, hey, our peer is down here. Our results are up here, right? And that's how you drive action in that area. If you don't have a consultant, there may be some, I think, like CIS. If you do a CIS, Critical Security Control Assessment, you can pick your industry, and it'll tell you how you compare against other industries. So that's also a good one to use. Highly recommended, especially if your security program isn't still getting off the ground or it's not well funded. It's a pretty affordable resource, and you can just do that quick comparison. And it helps you focus on the, I guess, the critical areas of your environment. Talked about using clear and simple diagrams, right? Diagrams will make it much easier for them to digest and to act on. So when it comes to the levels that you should be striving for, right? When it comes to the maturity of what you're presenting, right? I kind of spoke to this earlier. The first level is just you're there to inform, right? This is probably when you're first invited and you first get that opportunity. Like, don't try to go in there and shake, shake things up. Just say, okay, here's the state. Get a read of the room, and you're there to inform them. This is common. A lot of our metrics do this. We're just there. Hey, this is the current state, especially if things are in good order. You're just there to inform. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the next phase should be you should be in there trying to tell a story, right? Especially if you want something to happen, right? You want to, let's say you want to add new products to your portfolio, to your security stack. Start telling the story about these threats that are targeting your environment. I think the previous speaker, Dana, was just talking about profiling your threat actors and gathering all those TTPs. Well, if you don't have the ability to protect against those TTPs, then you need to start building that story out. And then lastly, right, is present something that will bring them in. Encourage that dialogue. And encourage them, right? Questions are not always a bad thing. Questions are a sign of interest, engagement. It's when there's difficult questions, obviously, when you're not performing well, so you still have to report that. And just be prepared. Be prepared for the reason of why you were not performing well. Maybe there was, it's not, as much as we put the blame on ourselves, sometimes the reason you're not performing is because you got pulled into other areas. Let's say there was a critical project that the organization was working on. That's a valid reason. You only have X amount of hours, and you can't be a hero all the time and make both things successful. Lastly, just some quick guidelines, right? Know your audience, be clear on your objectives, and as I mentioned, engage your peers, right? So I'd like to kind of close with this thought, right, it's this quote, right? I apologize for such a long letter. I didn't have time to write a short one. So yesterday, I gave a presentation to our security committee, and it was only about 12 slides in that deck, but it took my team about 2.5 weeks or more to put those together. Simplicity, even though sometimes we're trained to say, hey, the longer is better. In this instance, right? Embrace this concept that simplicity is hard, right? To boil these concepts down, to boil all these risks into one slide, takes a lot of thought, takes a lot of work, and it takes a lot of preparation from your team. So I will end there and open it up for questions. Thank you. Thank you.
Hey, Mark. Right here in the back, we have a virtual question online from Jawar Zaidi. Did you develop your own tool or use off-the-shelf tool to monitor vulnerability?
It was a combination. So the question is, again, was regarding the dashboard we presented. So the first iteration of that was in Excel, and it was powered by the Power Query function of Excel. So if you've never explored the Power Query function in Excel, it's like a whole new world. It makes it a lot more powerful. I don't want to take credit for this. This was actually done by my architect, who's actually here in the room. And so we started with Excel, and that worked perfectly fine, but then it didn't update automatically. So he moved it to Power BI, where it became more automated. So Power BI was the platform for that. And a few more questions going around, so thank you.
Hi. I'm Anna Sheveno from Brandeis University. My question is, can you share with us the most challenging cybersecurity event that you have come across at your current job or in the past?
Oh, okay. My lawyer's not here. But I can share with you because it's in the news, right? So our organization, we used Barracuda. And Barracuda, had a breach that was super simple to exploit, right? It's what the attackers needed to do was they craft an email and they put an attachment on there, and then when the sandbox feature of Barracuda would, examine that attachment, it would give the sender full, system level access to the device. And so it was something that, it was impossible to stop, right? And so we just had to deal with all the ramifications that went with it. So again, it was a very difficult experience, but it was a great learning experience, right? Because, it's a reminder, right? I'm going to pull out another security cliche here. It's not a matter of if, but when, right? You hear that all the time. And that's a reality, right? There's only so much you can do to protect. And so once it did happen, though, we had to execute. We had to execute our IR plans and just handle it, right? So thank you for that question. Oh, I see Martin from Enstall has a question.
First of all, great presentation. So thank you for that. I see a lot of challenges with CISOs that go to the board and the board rejects their requests for either more funding or more resources. And there's always a compromise, right, between money and resources. So how do you juggle that? I guess everybody faces that challenge at some point in their career, right?
So it's a great question with not a direct, simple. There's no silver bullet, unfortunately, right? So your question is how do I bring something to the board and get it approved, right? That's the essence.
Or more specifically, like let's say there's a high or critical risk in the organization that is going to require millions of dollars, and the board is like, "I'm sorry, we don't have the funding right now." I mean, you're kind of in a pretty tough spot, right? Because what happens if your company does get breached and you put that on the board and they didn't act on that? I don't know. How do you juggle that? It's a tricky one.
It's a very tricky question, right? And I think you need to. The concept I mentioned earlier is put yourselves in their shoes, right? You are one problem. Like, let's say you have 4 kids, right? And your one kid says they have this problem. You're only one of 4, right? So your issue is the biggest issue in the world to you. But to them, it could be, they may have just as high of an issue on another angle that they're looking at, right? Expansion or just maintaining the business, right? So what I would, I guess it's not a strategic level, but more of a strategy on something that I found that works. And you may see, a lot of, not to say it's a bad thing, but vendors may do this to you too. I think it's a marketing concept where you always present 3 options, right? You're not giving them the opportunity to say no. You're just saying, hey, pick an option from these 3. And try not to include status quo as an option unless it's absolutely necessary, because status quo basically means no, right? So you present to them, hey, option A is $1 million. Option B, if you want to try and do some tricks, option B is $2 million, right? Option C is $3 million. And so now they say, oh, well, it's only going to cost $1 million. It's better than $3 million. And again, this may not always work, right? These board members are very smart people. They're in their position for a reason. But it's people like options, right? Don't give them, hey, this is everything, yes or no, because no is such an easy answer, right? If you give them, hey, here's 3 options with a hidden 4th option, then they have to go out of their way maybe to say no to you. And so there's a lot of different concepts, right? But then maybe if you could get an understanding of their competing priorities, right? Going back to understanding their perspective. But I guess it comes back to also how well you are able to present the risk, right? If you're able to present the risk in business terms, don't say that, this could lead to downtime of our environment, but maybe if you could translate that risk to a dollar amount that says this downtime results in $100,000 per day of lost revenue, then it makes the decision a little bit easier. So again, the answer is not, I guess it's in how it's presented, right? And those are some strategies I'd say you can use.
Hey, Mark, I have, while we get the mic to the other side of the room, I have another virtual question from Elvis Moreland. When you document or determine the risks or residual risks, are you using a standard such as the Carnegie Mellon Cyber Operational Risk Taxonomy version 2?
Oh, it's a very specific question. I'm not using that specific version, right? So we built this. So the problem with risk assessments is that there's so many different ways to do it. And there's there's lots of different methods. I talked about a couple. I talked about FAIR. FAIR uses quantified risk assessments, right? You have ISACA's COBIT. You have the more popular one is probably NIST, Risk Management Framework. It's just because it's out there, it's free, you can use it. But to implement it to the standard that they want, it requires a team. It's not easy. So everybody kind of just looks at the different concepts. They look at the concept of what inherent risk is versus residual, and then you kind of just take those concepts and then you apply it. So we're leveraging concepts to the question on the phone. We're not using that specific model. Nobody had really recommended we did. I mean, maybe if you're mandated by an authority to use a certain model, you would. But in our case, we didn't. We looked at, I think, so the model that I'm moving towards, I mentioned, was the loss exceedance curve. That one uses some of those Monte Carlo analysis. Admittedly, those are a little bit smarter people invented that than I am. And so, but that's some of the method, right? Is you look at the probability, you multiply it like 1,000 times to see if it's how probable it would be happening, and then you apply the impact towards that. So, yeah, that's what we use. Thank you. Yes, sir. Do we have a mic for?
Oh, right here. Sorry.
Awesome.
Oh, right here.
Oh, hey, too close.
Yeah. Can you touch on your general approach or methodology in terms of like requesting and justifying your budget request?
Budget request. Okay. So it depends. It depends on the cycle of our budget, right? So we have an annual budget. I'm just speaking to how our organization works. We have an annual budget cycle wherein we would need to request something for next year, right? So that's the standard process. We go through our POCs around this time of the year. We're looking at stuff, and then we build out the justification, and we say, okay, I need this much CapEx or I need this much OpEx for this request, and then I build the justification, right? So in our organization, they may or may not, right? I may just need to write a line there that says, this is to address this key risk area within our environment, right? Let's say we have a outdated VPN system as an example, right? And I may put there our VPN system is outdated, which presents risk. I don't really need, our budget committee fortunately doesn't need to get into that level of quantified, risk. But other times, right, if it's an out-of-band request wherein we need to fix it now, that's where I can go, hey, we are under attack today, and we don't have a means of stopping it, right? And so that's very clear. It's business interrupting, business impacting, and as long as you're able to explain what the impact is to the organization, right? This could result in, let's say, account takeovers for our case, or it could result in a breach of our environment. It's very hard for a leadership to say, no, I accept the risk of getting breached and denying you that budget funding. So, sorry, I don't know if it's not too specific, but it's just more of a conceptual approach than that we take here. I think we have one question here, and then lady in the front.
So thank you. This is very interesting. I think you spoke to your audience. You did a great job there. Two questions. One, in your reporting, are you showing the board's stated risk tolerance somewhere of saying, hey, this is what you've told us you're willing to accept, and what it might cost you? And then the second one is, how do you deal with, I guess I'll call it category creep? I saw in one of your charts you had medium, high, and critical. Another one you had low, medium, and I've seen cases where you have critical, and then some people say, well, that's not as critical as other things, so we'll call it urgent, and this is more critical, so we'll call it emergency, and you wind up with all of these labels that can't be handled anymore because there's too many of them. So, thank you.
Oh, great, thank you. So I'll address the second one, then I'll come back to the first one because I might need to refresh it. But so on category creep, that's where I guess our job as risk professionals come in, right? So we're there to help provide our assessment, and it's best if you can move away from subjective, where you say this is critical because it was on the news today, right? Which is common, right? Cybersecurity has become, front headline news, and it's helped us in many ways. But then sometimes, right, you may be getting executives asking you about vulnerabilities that are not really impacting you, right? So if you can figure out if you can create a risk assessment methodology, you say this is the inherent risk, right? The inherent risk of this item that you're bringing to me could be high. But let's say you don't have that system in a location that increases that, right? So that's where this whole methodology of, okay, what are the controls that you have in place? So now you can document that. This is protected by a firewall, it's segmented, it's got application whitelisting, and we're restricting access to only necessary parties. So now those controls, and if you can show that those controls have all been tested, let's say you're a pen tester, your internal audit, so now you have a very solid, that's your risk assessment. You say, this is the risk, here's the residual risk based on all the controls that you have, and then you can bring it back and say, okay, in this case, you can actually say the residual risk of this is low. In your case, it sounds like they don't think it should be high, and you think it should be high, and then you do the same thing. You say, inherently, this is high risk because you don't have a control in place to reduce it. And if they tell you, well, it's inside the network, yes, but we've had breaches on our network due to our lack of MFA so many times, and so it's like a game of connecting the dots, and that's why some of these risk GRC systems, they're very complicated, right? You're trying to take an event that happened down here and correlate it back to something up here, because that's what your attackers do, right? They find, I think, the NetRisk presentation, they talked about how somebody gets in down here and they're able to traverse their network and get all the way to the crown jewels here. And so that's what makes our job as risk professionals, right? We have to look at all these seemingly isolated events and correlate them back against that big picture. So it's a little bit of a risk exercise where you need to figure out how to take this event, overlay it on which control it should apply to, and show that control is deficient. And then you can tell the whole story of why the residual risk is where it's at. And then your first question, I apologize, can I get you to repeat it? I want to make sure I answered it.
Risk tolerance. Oh.
Risk tolerance, yes.
Okay.
Thank you. So that is an extremely important concept because every organization has a different appetite for risk. And our job as risk professionals is to manage cyber risk against that appetite. We can't just come in and say, hey, no one would allow, let's say, access without MFA, right? Things like that. Again, that's not a good example. But every organization may have a different tolerance, and our job is to first establish that tolerance. Because if we try to go beyond it, then we're doing a disservice to the organization. We're spending more money. Like remember the example I showed about managing vulnerabilities? We can't go in there and say our risk score needs to be 0, because it'll never be 0. And if we try to make it 0, we're gonna use all the resources of the company. Remember, we shouldn't try to be bigger. I always tell people, my team this as well, is security should never be bigger than the business. Our job is to support them and keep them maintained, but our job is not to tell them they can't operate. Our job is to advise them on the risk, but we shouldn't be telling them, hey, you can't operate your business like this. They should be telling us what they're willing to accept, and then we can educate them as much as we can, and then we manage and operate to that risk. And a few more questions, I think, on this side.
Hi. Do you see a future where the elimination of credentials will be like a reality? Because these credentials are a great vehicle for scammers to hack networks and devices and accounts. Do you see such a future? And if yes, when?
So I'd like to, right? So the question is, can we, when you say credentials, I'm assuming you're referring to the username and passwords credentials, right? Because there has to be some sort of credential, but whether or not it's a memorized secret is the question. And when there's a lot of talk now, right, about the non-humans, right? The non-human accounts, right? They don't have somebody entering username and password. They're stored somewhere, right? They're stored in your password vault. The non-humans, it could be service accounts, it could be machine identities, it could be things of that nature. So, ideally, if we can find a methodology, right, where you're able to use, let's say, certificates, biometrics, or some combination of adaptive maybe authentication even, location, IP address, where you're at, wherein we can say that someone entering a username and password is not necessary. I think that'd be great. I think it could happen in the corporate setting, I struggle, us being a retail with online banking, I don't think, I think we're a little bit away from being able to do that in the consumer space, right? But there are solutions out there, right? If you can trust the device, if you can trust the phone and use some of the controls that are built into that device, then we could get to that state where maybe they don't need to enter a username and password, they use some other trusted mechanism. But yeah, so that's my prediction. Maybe it's there are a lot of people, maybe there's some vendors even who are much smarter who may have a more future solution, but that's my thought on this matter. And yes.
Hello. Thank you for giving us all this information. My question is, how often do you put together these reports for management, for higher management? Sometimes they get too much information, and then they go crazy with that. Sometimes they don't get it, and when something happens, they say, well, I didn't have the information. What is the, according to maybe the I don't want to say culture, but according to the area, for example, financial in your case, what would be the medium of how often you report this or allow them to see that data?
I'm glad you asked that question because it's something I wasn't able to touch on. So just to repeat her question, right, is how much detail do you put and what is the sweet spot? And again, your other question was how often. So right now our team reports quarterly on this. We have an internal management committee and we have a independent audit that we report to, or a board committee. And so the sweet spot there is you present the summary and then you include the details as an appendix. That's what I do. So for example, that risk summary I told you, there was a lot underneath it. So I attach the full risk control matrix as an appendix so that they can reference it if they have questions. Because you don't necessarily want them asking you that type of a pointed question when you're presenting. Most of the time you should be distributing this material to them ahead of time. They can review it and then they can say, okay, as long as they know, okay, why do we have this control deficiency here? And then they can drill into it, and then they can find the answer. So that's the approach I would take. It's been working for us very well. We've actually had other departments who have modeled after us just because that seems to work for our audience. I think I have 3 minutes left, so probably time for one more question or comment even, if anyone has any. Going once? All right. Well, I think there's dessert, so I don't want to be the one standing in your way. Thank you. Thank you very much.